In May of 1945, on the southern end of Okinawa, American infantry watched Japanese defenders do something they had never seen before. These were soldiers who had survived naval bombardment that cracked coral hills in half. Soldiers who had held their positions through artillery, airstrikes, and days of close assault. Soldiers who, by doctrine and by belief, did not retreat and did not surrender. And then a single Sherman tank crawled up the slope toward their cave, and some of them broke and ran into the open, into machine gun fire, rather than stay inside. The tank had not even fired yet. At first glance, the reports made no sense. These men feared nothing America had thrown at them for 4 years. But this tank was different. Its main gun was a lie. Inside the barrel where a cannon shell should have been, there was a hose. And what came out of that hose was the reason hardened veterans chose bullets over their own bunkers. But this story does not start on Okinawa. It starts with a problem that was killing Americans by the thousands, one cave at a time. By late 1943, Japanese commanders in the Pacific had learned a brutal lesson of their own. Defending the beaches meant dying on the beaches, under the guns of the American fleet. So the doctrine changed. At Biak, at Palaliu, and across the island chains, Japanese garrisons pulled back from the waterline and dug into the ground itself. Coral ridges were hollowed out into interconnected tunnel systems. Cave mouths were narrowed until a man had to crawl through them. Firing ports were cut into cliff faces at angles no naval gun could reach. On Palaliu, in September of 1944, the 1st Marine Division walked into the Umabrogel ridges expecting a 4-day fight. The pocket held out for over 2 months. American battleships fired shells heavier than automobiles into those ridges, and when the smoke cleared, the machine guns opened up again from the same holes. The math had turned upside down. Explosives crush what they can reach. A defender 30 feet inside a coral hillside, behind 2 bends in a tunnel, could not be reached. Every one of those positions had to be taken by riflemen, at close range, at terrible cost. The Pacific War had become a siege fought against the Earth itself. And the only weapon that reliably worked inside the Earth was fire. The Americans already had a flame weapon. The man-portable flamethrower rode on a soldier's back, roughly 70 pounds of fuel tanks and compressed gas. Marines used it with courage that is difficult to overstate, but the weapon punished the man who carried it. Its effective range was measured in a few dozen yards, which meant the operator had to walk, upright and slow, into the killing zone of the position he was trying to burn. He could not crawl, he could not sprint. Every Japanese rifleman on the ridge understood exactly what those tanks on his back meant, and what would happen to their bunker if he got close. Stories spread after the war that flamethrower operators had a battlefield life expectancy of only minutes. That specific figure has never been reliably documented, and historians treat it with caution. What the records do confirm is grim enough. Operators drew concentrated fire the moment they were recognized. Casualties among them ran high, and infantry commanders kept asking the same question. The flame worked. The problem was the man. So what if the man was removed from the equation entirely? What if the flame could arrive inside 30 tons of armor? The answer was not designed in a laboratory in Washington. It was welded together in workshops in Hawaii, and the story of how is one of the strangest procurement tales of the war. The Army's Chemical Warfare Service ran a small operation in the islands, working alongside Navy Seabees, the construction battalions whose welders and mechanics had a reputation for building anything out of anything. In early 1944, ahead of the invasion of the Marianas, they took Canadian-built Ronson flame guns, a system originally developed for British and Canadian vehicles, and mounted them into obsolete Stuart light tanks. 24 of these conversions were finished in time for Saipan. The crews called them Satan tanks. On Saipan and Tinian in the summer of 1944, the Satans proved the concept worked. Flame fired from behind armor could clear a cave mouth without spending infantry lives to approach it. But the Stuart was small, thin-skinned, and increasingly outclassed. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns could punch through it. The fuel supply was limited, the range was short. The concept needed a bigger host. It needed the Sherman. The conversion that followed was quietly radical. Earlier experiments had bolted small auxiliary flame guns onto Shermans next to the hull machine gun, and crews found them almost useless, short-range spitters that forced the tank dangerously close. The Hawaii workshops made a harder choice. They pulled the 75mm main gun out of the turret entirely and installed the flame system in its place, running the flame tube inside a false barrel so that from the outside the tank looked like any other Sherman. That deception mattered, and we will come back to why. The weapon carried roughly 300 gallons of fuel, and the fuel itself was the second revolution. Ordinary gasoline sprayed and splashed and burned out fast. Thickened with napalm, it flew farther, held together in the air, stuck to rock and timber and flesh, and burned far longer. With thickened fuel, the flame Sherman could throw a burning rod of jelly over 100 yards, around defilade, off cave walls, deep into tunnel mouths. Crews learned they could bounce the stream off a ridge face and pour fire around corners that no gun on Earth could shoot around. The official designation was a string of letters and numbers that almost nobody used. The men called them flame tanks, or Zippos, after the cigarette lighter that never failed to light. 8 of them were ready in February of 1945. Their destination was a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was the cave war in its purest and most terrible form. 21,000 Japanese defenders under General Kuribayashi had spent months turning the island into a fortress of tunnels, with miles of interconnected galleries cut into volcanic rock. There would be no banzai charges into American guns. Every position had to be dug out. The 8 flame Shermans were split between the 4th and 5th Marine Tank Battalions, 4 apiece, and within days of the landing they had become the most requested vehicles on the island. Marine after-action reporting from the campaign described infantry units specifically asking for flame tank support before assaulting fortified positions, and complained that 8 vehicles were nowhere near enough. The pattern repeated across the island's ridges. Riflemen would locate a bunker or cave complex that had already survived artillery and demolitions. A Zippo would move up under covering fire close to within range and saturate the position. Some defenders died in the flame itself. Others died in a way the Marines only understood later. A large flame shot into a confined cave devours the oxygen inside it. Men deep in the tunnels, far beyond the reach of the burning fuel, suffocated in the dark. It was a horrifying way to fight, and the men who directed it knew that. It was also, by every measure the Marines cared about, the most effective bunker weapon on the island. Positions that had eaten rifle squads fell in minutes. The 8 tanks were run so hard that maintenance crews worked through the nights to keep them firing. The lesson went up the chain of command with unusual speed. 8 was not enough. The next island would get an entire battalion. If you find this kind of documented, sourced military history worth your time, subscribe to Untold War Archives. We cover the orders, the fears, and the forgotten rules of war every week. By April of 1945, that battalion existed. The 713th Tank Battalion, armored and flame-throwing, was the only unit of its kind in the United States Army. 54 flame Shermans committed to the invasion of Okinawa. And Okinawa was where the weapon met its true opposite. The Japanese 32nd Army had built the Shuri line, a belt of fortified ridges, reverse-slope caves, and underground barracks that ran across the island's southern waste. American commanders came to describe the campaign's method with a phrase attributed to General Simon Bolivar Buckner, blowtorch and corkscrew. The blowtorch was the flame. The corkscrew was the demolition charge that followed it, sealing the position forever. For nearly 3 months, the flame Shermans of the 713th worked that line one position at a time. They burned the approaches to Kakazu Ridge. They fired into the honeycombed slopes around Shuri Castle. They supported infantry from 6 different divisions, parceled out company by company wherever the fighting was worst. The quantities involved are hard to grasp. By some accounts, the battalion fired roughly 200,000 gallons of napalm mixture during the campaign, a figure repeated in unit histories, though like many wartime totals, it is difficult to verify precisely. What is not disputed is the operational verdict. Infantry commanders on Okinawa rated the flame tank among the most valuable weapons on the island. Positions that were impervious to everything else were not impervious to this. The Japanese response is where this story turns, because it reveals what the defenders themselves believed. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from the campaign summarized in American intelligence reports, indicated that Japanese units had been instructed to prioritize the destruction of flame tanks. Anti-tank guns held their fire, letting ordinary Shermans pass, waiting to identify the one vehicle whose gun was a lie. This is why that false barrel mattered. From 400 yards, a gunner could not tell a Zippo from a standard tank, and that uncertainty forced Japanese crews into an impossible choice: fire early and reveal their position, or wait and risk letting the flame tank into range. Close assault teams carrying satchel charges and pole mines, men on what were openly suicide missions, were reported to single out the flame tanks when they could identify them. And at the other end of the psychological scale was the behavior American infantry kept witnessing. The thing that opened this story. Defenders who would not leave their caves for shellfire sometimes fled them at the sight of an approaching flame tank. Some historians argue this fear was as valuable as the weapon itself, that positions were abandoned or surrendered which would otherwise have cost a rifle company to clear. The evidence for that is scattered across after-action reports and veteran accounts, rather than clean statistics, and it deserves the hedge. But the pattern appears too often, from too many independent sources, to dismiss. The Flame Sherman did not just kill men. It broke something in men who had proven unbreakable. That is the fact that sits at the center of this weapon's story, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Fire occupies a different place in the human mind than steel does. A soldier can rationalize a bullet or a shell fragment. Burning and worse, suffocating in darkness as the air itself is consumed, reaches something older than training. American crews understood this, and the record suggests many of them carried it uneasily. Veterans of the Flame battalions gave interviews decades later, describing the work in flat, careful language, proud of the infantrymen they believed they had kept alive, and unwilling to describe what they had seen at the mouths of the caves. Because the arithmetic that justified the flame tank was real. Every fortified position it burned was a position that riflemen did not have to take by hand. On Okinawa, where American casualties passed 49,000, that arithmetic was not abstract. And yet the same arithmetic, extended one step further, pointed at the invasion of Japan itself, at an entire home island fortified like Shuri, and at flame tanks working through it cave by cave. The war ended before that calculation was tested. The Flame Shermans of the 713th were among the last of their kind to fight. The weapon soldiered on in Korea in small numbers, and then armies quietly moved away from flame weapons altogether until international protocols in the decades that followed restricted incendiary use against personnel. The Zippo tanks themselves mostly went to the scrapyard. Almost none survive. There is no famous memorial to them, no celebrated film, and the men who crewed them rarely spoke at reunions about what the weapon actually did. Perhaps that silence is the most honest monument the Flame Sherman could have. It was built in a shed in Hawaii to solve a problem no one in Washington had planned for. It worked with a terrible completeness, and the soldiers on both sides of its flame spent the rest of their lives trying not to remember it. On the ridges of Okinawa, fear was not a side effect of the weapon. Fear was the weapon. The fire was just how it was delivered.